Well, the war in Gaza has been on the agenda at the Arab League summit being held in Bahrain. Leaders there are trying to find a way to end the conflict. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas called on the international community to immediately begin implementing the two-state solution. He rejected the displacement of Palestinians and what he described as a repetition of the tragedy of the Nakba, saying that war crimes and genocide in Gaza have been ongoing for 7 months under US cover. Well, for more on all those stories, I'm joined now in the studio by Arise international correspondent Faith Orr. Good to see you, Faith. So the Arab League summit, let's start there, underway today in Bahrain. What's emerged? What can we expect?
Well, we heard from Bahrain's King Hamad, and he said this summit was being held under painful and unprecedented circumstances. He says the Palestinians are being denied the right to define the way that they live. They're being denied their freedoms, denied the right to a future. This is a gathering, of course, of Arab leaders, but also the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was there. He is urging Arab unity. He says there's no better time than now for Arab nations to unite and present that united front to the world. What struck me as quite interesting at this summit was that a lot of the speakers, a lot of the leaders urged international action, international community to do something about the war on Gaza. But when you listen to Palestinians, what they're asking for is Arab countries, is their neighbours, is what they describe as their brothers to help them. And the people here, I mean, they don't seem to be making any definite moves forward. There is going to be a peace conference, an international peace conference held in Manama in the coming months. They say that's to rebuild international momentum, to revive the two-state solution. Of course, we heard from Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. He is urging the international community to implement that two-state solution, but he's also asking for financial help. He says that Arab countries are not contributing the way that he would expect them to do so. We heard from Jordan's King Abdullah. He's saying that the international community must shoulder its moral responsibilities, help bringing this to an end. And we also heard from Egypt's President Sisi, who says that Israel is using the Rafah crossing to tighten its hold on the Strip. Now, what's interesting here is Israel is now blaming Egypt for closing the Rafah crossing. But we all saw with our own eyes the tanks, Israeli tanks, rolling into the crossing and closing it and barricading it and stopping that being used and stopping trucks entering. So the Egyptian president says it's simply lies from Israel's part. So lots of talk at this summit. We're yet to see if there'll be any action.
And briefly, would it be fair to say that if this time, after what has happened in the last 7 months, they're not able to successfully push for Palestinian statehood, then it'll likely never happen, which is why they have to seize this moment?
I mean, I'm not sure it's entirely in the hands of the Arab League. There's a lot of movement at the United Nations. Certainly this is one of the most consequential summits in years, and they are asking the Security Council again to go back and reconsider these decisions. I think in that one respect, all the Arab League can do is try and push the international community to act, because that isn't necessarily in their hands.
Meanwhile, fighting remains intense in Gaza, where the Israeli army says 5 of its soldiers were mistakenly killed by Israeli tank fire. Tell us more.
Yes, so these 5 soldiers, they were from the 202nd Battalion of Paratroopers, and they were killed in Jabalia. Now, what we understand is that they were in a building that was being used by the deputy commander of the battalion, and members of an ultra-Orthodox brigade, Hetz, they saw a gun barrel coming out of a window and they ordered each other to fire. So 5 soldiers were killed, another 7 wounded, 3 of those are in a critical condition. It brings the total now to 278 soldiers killed in Gaza since they invaded. 44 of those, 15%, died in what's being described by the army as operational accidents. It's quite a large percentage when you consider that there isn't actually an army that they're fighting. It's an armed group. You know, they don't have Hamas doesn't have a tank, for instance. So yeah, 15% of it is Israel firing on its own people.
Extraordinary. And in Rafah, of course, hundreds of thousands of Gazans have been forced to move again as the Israeli army inexorably closes in.
Absolutely. I just want to show you one video. This was taken just from the Kuwait hospital in Rafah today. And there was an attack on a home near, in fact, we can just look at that now. So this is filmed by people who are in the Kuwait hospital in Rafah. And people are rushing out because if you just see the smoke in the background there, Israel had launched an airstrike on a home just next to the gates of the hospital. A number of medical staff have been wounded. So we can see that even in those areas right next to a hospital, these attacks are continuing. 600,000 people have now fled Rafah, around 1 million people still sheltering there. Yoav Galant, the defence minister, actually says he's sending more forces to Rafah. Not just in Rafah, that all of this fighting is continuing, of course. Raging street battles in Jabalia. Residents there say there is constant shelling, and we've heard from Hamas that they are attacking Israeli tanks in Jabalia.
And you mentioned Yoav Galant there, who's the Israeli defense minister. He has directly challenged the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, in Israel, one can't think of a more important relationship than between the Prime Minister and the defense minister. Does this call into question the way the government functions? I mean, you have to wonder what the conversations in the war cabinet really are like at this point.
I mean, this is far from the first time that Galant and Netanyahu have had a public spat. Netanyahu threatened to fire him last March, well before this war started. This has been a fractious relationship for a long time. What's happened here is Galant has said he will oppose any long-term plan for military rule of Gaza. He wants to set up an alternative Palestinian leadership, an alternative to Hamas. He said he's been trying to promote this plan since October, but he's had no response from the Israeli cabinet. Netanyahu has sort of responded. He has said that Galant is using this as an excuse for not yet having defeated Hamas. He didn't actually name Galant when he said that, but it's fairly safe to assume that he is talking about him. Netanyahu is outnumbered though. Benny Gantz has said that Galant is speaking the truth. Benny Gantz, of course, an opponent of Netanyahu's, but another member of the war cabinet and one with voting power. Netanyahu outnumbered on this, but as I say, far from the first time that these two have had a public falling out. I'm sure it won't be the last.
Meanwhile, of course, Mr. Galant still presiding over the intensification of the operation against Hamas in Rafah. As you mentioned, they're sending more troops in. But let's turn to South Africa's genocide allegation against Israel over its war in Gaza. South Africa has returned to the UN's highest court. What's the country's latest argument?
Their latest argument is that the situation has changed irrevocably compared to the last time that the court issued these measures, that these measures are no longer relevant, no longer appropriate, no longer strong enough. They want the court to order Israel to cease hostilities in Rafah and cease operations in other parts of Gaza. There have been quite strong statements in the ICJ today from South Africa. They say this is the last chance to save any hope of a Palestinian life in Gaza, and that the Israeli officials and Israeli members of the forces understand that their mission is to simply wipe life out in Gaza, wipe out Palestinian life. They say they've been treating evacuation areas like extermination zones. And actually the fact that the Israelis shot 5 of their own people today would back up that theory that they really are just firing indiscriminately. Rafah has been described as the final stand. The South African lawyer said without Rafah, there is no more Palestinian life in Gaza to speak of, no more Palestinian identity, and no possibility of reconstruction. They've said that Israel used the cover of the last measures that were ordered to continue and ramp up its attacks, because the court did not order it to stop. It simply said prevent genocide, which Israel does not interpret what it's doing as genocide, therefore it feels it can continue. But the arguments now is that ordering, these smaller orders to allow aid in, to safeguard civilians, simply not enough when Israel blatantly disregards what the court is saying. South Africa said today that the rule of law can only survive through the orders of this court. If the rule of law is to have any meaning, let it be today and with this case. They also said one interesting thing, that Israel is increasingly using artificial intelligence to select the Palestinians that are targets for killing by drones, by missiles fired from fighter jets. They're using this artificial intelligence and it can be very tenuous. So if you're in a WhatsApp group with someone who has been deemed a target, you can then also become a target. I mean, if you think how many
That's
people...
a bit worrying,
exactly. How many people are you in a WhatsApp group with if one of them happens to be...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you may not even know.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
So lots of interesting things today. Israel will have their say tomorrow.
Faith, thanks very much indeed. We're up to date. Faith Orr, Arise International correspondent.